investing into dividend ETFs can be one of the easiest ways for nearly anyone to have your money passively generate an income for you. And because I know many dividend investors out there want to get started before that standard retirement age for tax managed accounts like the IRA, that is age 59.5 or above, in this video I'm going to break down 6 of the top dividend ETFs for normal taxable brokerage accounts and even explain which would be best for you depending on your situation and personal goals. But before we get started, my name is Danny Sully, and all I ask is if you do find value in this video, that you consider hitting the like and subscribe button for future content like this. With that said, the first ETF to mention here is if you are one solely looking for a growth potential that pays a dividend, and that would be best from the Vanguard S&P 500 ETF, VOO. Now you may be wondering, why am I adding the S&P 500 into this list because it's not really considered a dividend investment? I do realize that, but the reason that I've added it is because I have to emphasize the importance of tax efficiency and the overall return that you can earn over time as you invest, especially in a normal taxable account and if you are one taking an income. You see, if you solely went for the dividends and you bought a fund that pays a 6% dividend yield, but the total annual return that you averaged over time was 2%, which remember, that assumes that you reinvested the dividends. So if you actually took the dividend income out of that investment, the true value of your underlying investment would have declined 4% per year. All in all that means is that on a $100,000 investment, you would have generated $6,000 from dividends in the first year, which sounds great, but your actual investment would end up being $96,000, and after years of doing this, you're headed in the wrong direction. But all in all, just remember that a high dividend yield is not always the best case, and even popular investments like JPI and JPQ that pay an 8 to 10% yield with a strong growth potential to keep up with inflation, they are just not very tax efficient investments, and is why I personally don't recommend them in taxable accounts, but that's my own choice. So as far as owning the S&P 500, I view this as a great way to diversify a dividend investing portfolio to ensure that you are still capturing the upside and growth potential for your portfolio. And so to quickly break down VOO, the fund initially launched in September of 2010. It is currently the largest ETF in the world from having roughly $850 billion in assets under its management. The fund has a super low cost of 0.03%, which means that for every $10,000 that you invest, it would cost you $3 per year in fees. And do know that those fees are going to be automatically taken out of your investment over time. It's not something that you have to pay separately. But following that, VOO has 504 holdings in the fund, where top companies include Nvidia, Apple, and Microsoft, that each make up about 6 to 7% of the entire fund's weight. And because of that, if we were to add up the top 10 holdings, they make up roughly 39% of the entire fund, where technology is the largest sector that's in the fund that has about 34% of the weight. But notice how the dividend yield over the past 12 months is 1.11%, and while that may seem super low for you, if you combine this with other dividend ETFs, it only improves the likelihood of achieving that strong growth while taking out a nice income. Which, notice that from 2025, it was reported that if you held the investments long enough, you could potentially reap 97% in qualified dividends. That is a really important note to realize that many, I feel, don't look at, because dividends, if you are potentially getting qualified dividends, they could then be taxed in the long-term capital gains tax brackets that are 0, 15, or 20%, depending on your financial situation, and this is much more favorable. Now realize that VOO pays out dividends on a quarterly basis, which most of the ones I'm showing you in this video do, but there are 2 ETFs that I'm going to mention later in the video that pay out dividends on a monthly basis. But to finish VOO, over the past year, as of January 31st, 2026, the fund has grown 16.39% over the past year. Over the past 3, it's averaged just over 21%. Over the past 5 years, it averaged about 15%. And then over the past 10 years, VOO has averaged about 15.5% per year, which remember, that already factors in the expense ratio, and it assumes that you reinvested the dividends. So even if you took the dividends out of this for the income, on average over the past 10 years, the true value of VOO would have still averaged over 14% per year, which even helps your dividend income grow over time as well. But now that you understand the importance of growth and why I mentioned it in this specific video, the second ETF to mention here is now for an income through the Schwab US Dividend Equity ETF, SCHD. Now, SCHD holds the crown to being my favorite overall dividend ETF for those that want a solid growth potential, reduced volatility, while still reaping a very strong tax-efficient dividend income. And so first know that SCHD tracks the total return of the Dow Jones US Dividend 100 Index that is focused on quality and sustainability of dividends that invest in stocks selected for fundamental strength relative to their peers based on financial ratios. Now, this fund launched in October of 2011. It has 102 holdings, where the top companies here are more dividend oriented, where you may have heard of Lockheed Martin, Chevron, or Pepsi as popular dividend stocks. And so the top 10 holdings here make up roughly 40% of the entire fund. Energy is the largest sector at about 19% of the weight. The fund also has a 0.06% expense ratio, and over the past year, it has paid out a dividend yield of 3.34%, where the dividends have actually grown at a rate of 10.61% per year over the past 10 years. Not just that, but the potential in qualified dividends was really strong, where it was 100% as of 2024, and SCHD pays out a dividend on a quarterly basis. The fund also has $76 billion in assets under its management. The past 5-year average was just about 11%, and then over the past 10 years, SCHD has averaged just under 13% per year, which means that even if you took the dividends as income, the value of your underlying investment would still have averaged just about 9% per year in growth. And then the last thing to mention here is just to realize that SCHD only has a 7% overlap by weight with the S&P 500, so diversification between these two is very strong. But knowing that, the next two options to look at are actually going to be for a monthly income, with the first one being through the Wisdom Tree US Quality Dividend Growth Fund with the ticker DGRW. Now, DGRW tracks the Wisdom Tree US Quality Dividend Growth Index, and although this fund is more growth oriented and it doesn't provide a super high dividend yield, the potential for a monthly income and appreciation in value over time, to me, it's worth it if that's something that you're looking for. And so first know that DGRW launched in May of 2013, currently has 200 holdings, where the top 10 make up about 40% of the entire fund. Information technology is the largest sector that makes up the fund with about 26% of the weight. But the one thing to mention here is that the fund is the most expensive of all the ones I'm mentioning in this video, where it has a 0.28% expense ratio. So if you don't care for a monthly income, you may be better off just sticking with VOO or other options and combining them with other dividend ETFs. Now, DGRW over the past year has paid out a dividend yield of 1.39%. The dividends have grown at a rate of 6.83%, and data from 2023 reports that the dividend income could potentially be 100% in qualified dividends if held long enough. And most importantly, you could reap a monthly income from this ETF. Now, DGRW currently has $16 billion in assets under its management. Over the past 3 years, it has averaged just under 16% per year. The past 5-year average was 12.66%, and over the past 10 years, DGRW has averaged 13.67%, which has underperformed the S&P 500. So realize the trade-offs that you take when you choose an ETF like this. But one cool stat that I have to mention here is that DGRW's worst year over the past 10 years was down only 6%, where VOO was down 18%. And according to this data, which by the way is from Portfolio Visualizer, DGRW underperformed by 1% per year on average, which that includes the 0.28% expense ratio, which definitely doesn't help out that case. And then lastly, realize that DGRW has a 53% overlap by weight with the S&P 500, and when compared to the SCHD, there is a 15% overlap by weight with DGRW. Knowing that, the second monthly income ETF you may like is the Spider Dow Jones Industrial Average ETF Trust with the ticker of DIA. Now, DIA tracks the Dow Jones Industrial Average that launched in January of 1998. The fund has 30 holdings, where you can see the top ones that lead the pack are currently Goldman Sachs at 11.5% and Caterpillar with just over 9% of the weight toward the fund, where when we add up the top 10 holdings, they make up roughly 32% of the entire fund, with financials being the largest sector at about 28% of the weight. And then realize that the expense ratio here is slightly better than DGRW, where for DIA it is 0.16%. And then over the past year, the dividends have paid out a 1.38% yield that have grown at a rate of 5.6% per year on average over the past 10 years. You can also see that this is a very tax-efficient investment with the potential of 100% in qualified dividends, where the dividends are paid out on a monthly basis. And there is some popularity to this fund because it currently has $44 billion in assets under its management, Over the past 3 years, it has averaged 14.7% per year. The past 5-year average came out to be 12.2%. And then if we look over the past 10 years, that was 13.76%, which is relatively the same, very close to DGRW, but there's just a few structural differences. Which, not to mention, but DIA also has a 27% overlap by weight with the S&P 500 and a 14% overlap with SCHD. Now, the choice on how you choose is completely up to you, but let's now go over the best for growth and income, with the first one being the iShares Core Dividend Growth ETF. It tracks the Morningstar US Dividend Growth Index that officially launched in June of 2014. The fund currently has 396 holdings, where the top 10 make up nearly 26% of the entire fund. Financials is the largest sector at about 20%. The expense ratio is 0.08%, and the dividend yield that it paid out over the past year was 1.96%, where the dividends have grown at a rate of 8.59% over the past 10 years on average. And not to mention, but DGRO has offered the potential for 100% in qualified dividends paid out on a quarterly basis, where the fund has $37 billion in assets under its management. Over the past 3 years, it's averaged about 14.5%. The past 5 years was about just under 13%. And then the past 10-year average was 13.88%, which would still allow your portfolio to grow very well as you take out an income. Now, DGRO has a 43% overlap by weight with the S&P 500 and a 17% overlap with SCHD. But knowing that, the last ETF to mention here is the Vanguard High Dividend Yield ETF with the ticker of VYM that tracks the FTSE High Dividend Yield Index that launched in November of 2006. It has 563 holdings, where the top 10 make up about 27% of the fund. Financials is the largest sector with almost 22% of the weight. There is a 0.06% expense ratio. Over the past year, VYM has paid out a 2.25% dividend yield that has grown on average 5% per year over the past 10 years, where this fund also shows the potential in 100% qualified dividends that's paid out on a quarterly basis. And the fund has $72 billion in assets under its management, which if we look over the past 3 years, the fund has averaged just under 14% per year, which is roughly the same for the past 5-year average. And then if we look at the past 10 years, that is 12.14%. But do know that VYM has a 34% overlap by weight with the S&P 500 and 19% with SCHD. All in all, this is a solid ETF to consider, but if you are one looking for a bit more growth rather than the high dividend yield, Vanguard has another solid option you could at least know about, that is the Vanguard Dividend Appreciation ETF with the ticker of VIG. All right, so knowing these 6 ETFs, let's finish this off with a simple portfolio example. Now, there are many ways that you could go about this based on your own situation and personal goals, but a simple example here would be, let's say that you put 50% in SCHD, since you like the idea of getting an income, then 30% in VOO to assist with growing the portfolio, and then you like the idea of a small monthly income on top of that, and you may want to put 10% in DGRW and 10% into DIA. Now, first know that we are going to assume that you take the dividends as income right away and every time, and that you initially start with $200,000, because if you do this, then that means after 10 years, your investment would be worth close to $500,000 from gaining a total of about 10.5% of a return on your investment after taking out the dividend income. And as I mentioned, the importance of true growth, if you only owned the S&P 500 VOO and took the 1% dividend yield from that, your portfolio would have instead grown from $200,000 to now roughly $620,000 after 10 years, giving you over an extra $100,000, but realize that the income throughout the years would have been less. But to first look at this dividend portfolio, realize that in your first year, you would have earned just over $5,000 from a dividend income, and as you invest and see true growth with your investment, after 10 years, your dividend income would be just over $11,000. Now, if you reaped qualified dividends from this with the long-term capital gains tax rates, depending on your income, you may even get away with paying 0% in federal income tax. You see, for 2026, the 0% bracket for single filers is $49,000, and if you use the standard deduction of $16,000 for 2026, that means if your total income is under $65,000, including the dividend income factored into that, then that means that you can end up paying no federal income tax on the dividend income. Now, I've created an entire free index fund cheat sheet that shows data continuously updated on these ETFs and many more of the top options, which I'll have a direct link in the description below for you. Which while you're at it, consider joining our free newsletters to stay ahead of your finances, or other resources of ours like top brokerage accounts to consider, or even our top investing tools and resources that we use for gathering data on investments like these. End of the day, our mission at InvestLane is to help you save and invest wisely to build lasting wealth. So please do whatever you believe is best for your situation. This is not financial advice, and you must do your own research. Which, if you found value in this video, don't forget to hit the like, subscribe, and notifications button for future content like this.